Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in the Russian economy, and specifically to talk about the devastating impact of the increase in the sanctions that was announced at the end of February 2024. As part of those increased sanctions, the USA applied sanctions against a Russian company called Sovcomflot, and Sovcomflot owns around 120 oil tankers and transports around 12% of all of Russia's oil exports. Now, as a direct result of Sovcomflot being sanctioned, India's largest private oil refinery business, called Reliance, which actually operates the largest single oil refinery in the world, has come out and said that it will no longer take any delivery of Russian oil that's being transported by Sovcomflot. And that's going to be a major blow to Russia at a time when India has already started to reduce the amount of oil that it's buying from Russia. Over the last 6 months, there has been a significant fall, and India is now starting to increase its purchases from the USA. So this is categorical evidence that the sanctions are having an impact on Russia, its business, and its income. So in today's video, I'll have a look at the increased sanctions that were announced at the end of February. We'll talk about the level of trade that's happening right now between India and Russia and why that started to reduce and why these sanctions are going to have a further impact on the amount of oil that India is buying from Russia. We'll then have a look at Sovcomflot itself and what the impact of that business being sanctioned will be on the Russian economy. And then finally today I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think the implications of this new raft of sanctions will be on the Russian economy and what the impact of the reduced level of trading with India will have on Russia's income. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say thank you so much to everybody that's supporting the channel. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks recently, thank you so much for the time and effort that you've taken to do that. I really appreciate it. And if you've signed up as a Patreon or a YouTube member or a Buy Me a Coffee member, thank you for your long-term support. It really helps me to keep the channel going and motivates me to make more videos. And if you'd like a chance of winning this statue, Stiltman, which has been one of the original statues that's featured on the channel for the last few years, then please check out the video at the end of today's video. As I mentioned at the start of today's video, in February the USA ramped up the sanctions being applied against Russia. They identified a whole host of additional companies that were now being sanctioned. And the reason that this is important is because of what's happening with the price of oil. Back in December 2022, the West introduced a price cap of $60 per barrel for Russian oil. So basically, Russia was no longer able to sell anything above $60. Now, when the price of oil was low, that didn't have any real impact because if the general market price was down at around 70 and Russia was selling at a discount of around $20, then basically they were below the cap anyway. But because of the recent upward movements in general oil prices, that's pulled up the price of Russian oil and meant that it's now trading above the $60 cap. This chart shows the movement in the price of Brent crude oil and Russian Urals oil over the past 12 months. And as you can see, there is a clear differential between the two prices because Russian oil is still trading at a discount to general oil prices. Because of the sanctions in place against Russian oil and the risks that the companies dealing with Russia are incurring, Russia still has to offer a discount to encourage buyers to do deals with them. Now, if we start off by looking at the prices 12 months ago, a barrel of crude oil was trading for $74 and a barrel of Russian oil was trading for $48. So this time last year, the discount that Russia was offering was $26 per barrel, or around 35%. And interestingly, because the price was only $48 per barrel, there was no risk of any company that was dealing with Russia being hit with sanctions because it was well below the $60 per barrel price cap that had been set by the West. If we now look at the movement in the price of oil between March and September 2023, you can see that generally oil prices rose as a result of an increase in demand for oil, which drove prices up, and also the fact that OPEC Plus cut its production, so it reduced supply. And as I'm sure you'll be aware from simple economics, when you get a reduction in supply and demand remains at the same level, that generally forces prices up. And by the end of September 2023, the price of a barrel of crude oil had increased to $96. And interestingly, at that stage, the price of a barrel of Russian oil had increased to $80, meaning that it was only trading at a discount of around $15, or around 15% against general market prices. And you can see from the chart that there is a clear narrowing of the gap between the two lines as the discounts got smaller on Russian oil. And the reason why the price of Russian oil went up and the discounts went down was because India was buying huge quantities of oil directly from Russia. At one stage, it was buying more than 2 million barrels of oil per day, making it Russia's largest customer. India had actually overtaken China at that point. However, the fundamental problem with these deals was that the price being struck was above the $60 price cap that had been set by the West. India was buying oil at $80 per barrel, which was in clear breach of the sanctions. And as a result, the West decided that they needed to increase the sanctions and increase the policing of those sanctions and start imposing penalties on any company that was found guilty of dealing with Russia and buying oil above $60 per barrel. Now, as you can see, between October 23 and January 24, the global price of oil started to come down as a result of a slowdown in the global economy and concerns about the future of China's economy, specifically as China is such a big buyer of oil. And the price of Urals oil actually fell back below $60 per barrel, so was no longer a major issue in terms of breaching those sanctions. However, if you look at what's happened over the last couple of months, oil prices have now started to go back up again, partly as a result of the fact that OPEC Plus have announced further cuts, and partly as a result of the problems that Russia is now having with its oil production. And as a result of these general price increases, the price of a barrel of Russian oil has now once again risen above $60 per barrel, which means that the West is now once again cracking down on any companies that are buying Russian oil above this level. In October, the USA imposed the first sanctions on owners of tankers carrying Russian oil priced above the price cap of $60 per barrel, one in Turkey and one in the United Arab Emirates, in an effort to close loopholes in the mechanism designed to punish Moscow for its war in Ukraine. The US administration placed sanctions on Turkey-based Ice Pearl Navigation, owner of the Yasser Golden Bosphorus, which the Treasury said carried Russian ESPO crude priced above $80 per barrel. The US also imposed them on United Arab Emirates-based Lumber Marine, owner of the SCF Primore, which the Treasury said was carrying Novoport Russian crude above $75 per barrel. At the start of February, the US Treasury Department announced that it had placed sanctions against 3 entities based in the United Arab Emirates and 1 tanker registered by Liberia for violating the price cap on Russian oil. On February the 23rd, the USA announced that it had imposed new trade sanctions on 93 entities from Russia, China, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, Kazakhstan, India and South Korea for supporting Russia's war efforts in Ukraine. On the same day, the US also imposed sanctions on over 500 targets over the war and death of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. Earlier in the same week, the European Union approved the 13th package of Ukraine-related sanctions against Russia, banning nearly 200 entities and individuals accused of helping Moscow procure weapons or of involvement in kidnapping Ukrainian children. Of the 93 entities named by the USA, some were companies added for diverting controlled microelectronics to Russia's military and intelligence authorities, and others were targeted for procuring American equipment to help Russia replenish its munitions and other military goods. However, the single largest company that was identified was Russia's leading oil tanker group, Sovcomflot. As Washington seeks to reduce Russia's revenues from oil sales it can use to support the invasion of Ukraine. The US Treasury's Office of Foreign Asset Control also designated 14 crude oil tanker vessels as property in which Sovcomflot has an interest. And the US Treasury official was quoted as saying, Sovcomflot as a whole, as a parent company, has been implicated in price cap violations in addition to deceptive activity. And this page from the Sovcomflot website shows that the company operates 120 oil tankers, 13 gas tankers, 12 specialised vessels and 2 dry cargo fleet. And this press release published by the Russian news agency TASS in September 23 shows the importance of Sovcomflot to Russia's exports, and its chief executive at that point said, according to our estimates, Sovcomflot's share of the market was around 12% over the past several years. Considering the existing investment plans, we plan to boost this share. As a direct result of both the increase in the sanctions and the increased policing of the sanctions, Indian companies are now stepping back from dealing with Russia, and Russia is seeing a huge reduction in the amount of oil that it's selling directly into India. On the 20th of March, it was announced that India's Reliance Industries, operator of the world's biggest refining complex, will not buy Russian oil loaded on tankers operated by shipper Sovcomflot after recent US sanctions. And it's been reported that other Indian oil refiners also plan to follow suit and ban all deliveries from Sovcomflot vessels. Indian refiners are reported to be seeking to avoid any backlash from Washington and are being extra cautious due to tighter scrutiny on Russian oil deals by banks and US authorities. The refiners want to prevent the involvement of entities that are directly or indirectly sanctioned. And an Indian government source was quoted as saying, "Our preference is that refiners should not take oil in sanctioned vessels because of our political and commercial interests and the USA sanctions." And in order to assess the potential impact of the sanctions on Russia's revenue, let's have a look at what's been happening with Russia's oil exports since the start of the war in Ukraine. This chart shows the destination of Russia's oil exports dating back to January 2022, which was a month before the invasion of Ukraine started. And the different colours we've got here represent the different countries that are buying that oil. The red section at the bottom are purchases from China. The orange section in the middle are purchases from India. The grey section is a collection of other countries, predominantly European countries. As you can see, a lot of those purchases were at the start of this period. And the green section at the top, which is the other major buyer, is Turkey. And the scale on the left-hand side of this chart is shown in thousands of tonnes. So we're looking here at the volume of oil exported rather than the value. So that's why we don't have the fluctuations that you would normally see on a chart like this as the price of oil moves up and down. So if we start off by looking at the situation in January 22, you can see that the majority of oil that Russia was exporting at that point is in the grey section, which are other countries. And those other countries are the European countries who were Russia's biggest customers at that point before the war started. But as you can also see, there was a huge reduction in the purchases by European countries throughout 2022. And by the start of 2023, Europe was buying virtually no oil from Russia. If we now look at the red section at the bottom, which represents purchases from China, you can see that that's remained relatively constant and has actually increased over the last 2 years. But there hasn't been a significant increase. There's not been a huge surge in purchases from China. Back in January 2022, China was purchasing around 120 tonnes of oil, and today those seaborne deliveries have increased to around 1.2 million barrels per day. So an increase of roughly around 50% over the last 2 years. But if we now look at the movement in the purchases from India, that has been the most significant change from Russia's point of view over the last 2 years. In January and February 2022, India purchased virtually zero oil from Russia. However, as a result of the discounts that Russia started to offer after its invasion of Ukraine, India started buying large quantities. And by the middle of 2023, it had become Russia's single largest customer, purchasing over 2 million barrels of oil every single day. However, as a result of the increase in the policing of the sanctions, by October 23, those purchases had reduced to around 1.4 million barrels per day. And if you look at what's happened over the last few weeks, there has been a significant reduction. And the most recent figures show that the purchases are down to 1 million barrels per day currently. However, given the increased policing and the fact that Urals oil is trading above the $60 cap, it's likely that those purchases will continue reducing, and this is going to cause major problems from Russia's point of view because they simply don't have any other countries to be able to divert that volume of oil to. And this is one of the reasons why Russia has been announcing cutbacks in terms of its exporting of oil, because it doesn't have the customers to be able to sell to, and as a result, it's having to cut back on production. And as I mentioned at the start of today's video, India has now started buying more oil directly from the USA. This chart shows the monthly amount of US oil purchased by India dating back to March 2022. And what this shows is that over the last few months, there's been a significant increase in the amount of oil that India is purchasing from the USA. And the forward order deliveries of 7 million barrels for April 2024 represents the largest purchase that India has made from the USA since May 2023. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think what's happening with India and the sanctions is absolutely critical to the future success of the Russian economy. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it was hit by sanctions from most of its biggest customers. At that point, Russia was selling huge volumes of oil directly into Europe. But as a result of the invasion, most of those buyers turned their back on Russia and said, "We're not interested in buying your oil at any price." And obviously the main driver for those sanctions was to stop Russian income in order to get it around the table and put an end to the war in Ukraine. Now, what Russia decided to do was offer its oil at a discount to anybody that wanted to buy it. And at that point, India thought that that was just too good a deal to turn down. And so India went from buying virtually no Russian oil to buying over 2 million barrels per day. It became Russia's biggest single customer. And at that time, it looked like a great deal from Russia's point of view and from India's point of view. But the USA and the West decided that this just wasn't right. That was not why the sanctions were put in place, in order to help India be able to buy oil at very low prices. And the reality of the situation was that it took some time for the policing of the sanctions to actually be put into place. So for 8 or 9 months, India was happily buying cheap Russian oil and nothing was happening. However, from October 23, the USA managed to get its act together and start actively policing all of the sanctions. And from that point on, we have seen various companies and vessels being hit with direct sanctions. And what that means is that if you're hit by sanctions, you can no longer do trade with anybody else apart from Russia, because the West will turn their back on you. And obviously, from a global point of view, Russia is not the only game in town. If you're in international business, you want to be able to do business with everybody in the world. That's how you maximize your sales. But if you get hit with sanctions, obviously that's going to have a devastating impact on your business. And what we've seen over the past 6 months or so is because of the increase in the sanctions and the fact that more and more companies are being hit with these sanctions, such as Sovcomflot, one of the biggest exporters of Russian oil, Indian businesses are now taking a step back and saying, if there's any risk that if I do business with you, that I'm going to lose all of my other external business, then I'm not going to take that risk. And that's exactly what we're seeing. And Reliance, one of the biggest refiners of oil in the world, they actually run the biggest oil refinery out of anywhere in the world. They've now come out and said, we're not prepared to deal with Sovcomflot, and it looks like the rest of India is going to follow suit. And that's going to have a huge impact on Russia because Sovcomflot is its #1 exporter. That's the business that it's using predominantly to export oil from Russia to places like India. So Sovcomflot now will be restricted to dealing with countries that don't care about the sanctions, so potentially China. But as we saw from the data in the chart earlier, China is only taking around 1.2 million barrels of oil via the sea. It's taking a lot of the oil directly from pipelines. So that's going to put pressure on Sovcomflot because now it's going to have to focus its efforts on just delivering to China and any other countries that don't care about the sanctions. But from Russia's point of view, it's now got a major problem because if it's going to be able to sell oil to India, if it's going to continue making sales of over 1 million barrels per day, those deals are going to have to comply with the price cap. So the deal is going to be less than $60 per barrel. And at the moment, Russia is managing to achieve almost $80 per barrel in terms of the price that it's selling. So what that means from Russia's point of view is that it's going to face an immediate 25% loss of all of the income that it's earning directly from India. And that's going to hurt the Russian economy because it's not just a case of losing 25%. When you're talking about oil and gas, these are industries that have a huge fixed cost base. So when you're facing the prospect of a 25% reduction in income, in many cases, that can mean that you move from making a profit to making a loss on those sales. And obviously, from Russia's point of view, that's absolutely disastrous. But taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture here, the ongoing policing of the sanctions and the increase in the number of companies that are being sanctioned means that the walls are closing in on Russia. Russia now has less and less options in terms of who it can do business with. And India was its main port of call. That was where it turned to immediately following the invasion of Ukraine. But what we've seen from today's video is that India is now becoming much more selective in terms of the deals that it's prepared to do with Russia, and those deals are likely to have to comply with the price caps, which means that Russia is going to have less income coming into its economy, and this will put further pressure on the Russian economy at a time when the oil industry is already under huge pressure as a result of the drone attacks that are now being undertaken by Ukraine. They're damaging the refineries in Russia, and as a result of that, Russia now needs to export more crude oil because it can't send as much of its crude oil to its own refineries because their capacity has been reduced. In the past, it would have sent most of that crude oil to India at low prices, but because of the policing of the sanctions, Russia is now facing the very real prospect of having to sign up and agree to sell all of its oil for less than $60 per barrel, and that's going to have a hugely negative impact on the Russian economy. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face. I've got some really exciting news for you. I've decided to give away another one of my statues, and this time it's this guy, the man on stilts. Now, if you've been watching my channel, you'll know that this is one of the original pieces that I've been showing in the background for the last few years. This is a truly amazing piece. I absolutely love it. And it's made by a British artist called Paul Moggetts, and he makes a limited number of each one of his pieces, and I've managed to secure a second one of these. But I'm giving this one away, which is the original one that I've had in the background for the last few years. And if you'd like to win it, you just need to buy a ticket in the raffle, which are priced at £1 each, which is around $1.30. So very affordable. So if you'd like to support the channel, rather than buying me a coffee or sending me a YouTube super thanks, why don't you buy a ticket in the raffle and you could have this in your home some point soon. Now, in terms of organising this, I've got an independent company to collect the cash and make the draw for me. So I won't be choosing it. It will be entirely at random. And I will post this anywhere in the world to whoever wins it. There is a possibility that you may need to pay a little bit of import duty depending on where you live and what the rules are. But I will send this anywhere. So if you'd like to win it, please buy a ticket in the raffle and good luck.